rapid logging in of participants. Maybe we'll wait till the critical mass of 50. Brilliant. Okay. Whilst people are still joining, I might just start with a few housekeeping rules, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay. And good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharon Tao, the Education Director and Team Leader of the Girls Education Challenge Fund Manager. And as I kind of mentioned before we start, if I could cover some housekeeping rules. In the interests of bandwidth, could we all please keep our cameras off and also go on mute? I can kind of hear some feedback already. So if you are not speaking, if you could turn your cameras off and go on mute, we'd be very grateful. Of course, if you are speaking, asking a question later, please feel free to turn on your camera and go off mute. We also wanted to let you know, you might see on the screen that we are going to be recording this session. Please do let us know if you have any concerns about this. And finally, we at the end of the webinar will be giving a link to a very brief survey for participants, just so that we can make sure that we're constantly improving our practice with this discussion series. So if you could please stay on at the end and fill out the survey for us, we'd be very, very grateful. I believe my colleague is going to provide the link now and also at the end of the webinar. So good. Why don't we make a start? I'd like to welcome all of you to our first webinar of the Girls Education Challenge Discussion Series. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Girls Education Challenge, the GEC is funded by FCDO and is comprised of 41 projects across 17 different countries implemented by different organizations and partners. And although there is great variance in the size and scope of the 41 GEC projects, all of them aim to support the most marginalized girls, either those who have dropped out or never attended school, or those who may be enrolled in school, but who are at the most at risk of dropping out. And that said, this discussion series aims to present the GEC's learning and analysis regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on girls and how the GEC projects, fund manager, and independent evaluator responded to these impacts in their different roles and capacities. In upcoming webinars in the series, we'll be hearing about how GEC projects in Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe partnered with government and community networks to respond to COVID-19. We'll be discussing the gender responsive approaches and lessons learned from South Asia. And we'll also be diving deeper into 2 innovative COVID responses that came out of projects in Afghanistan. But today, we will be hearing from colleagues representing the GEC's independent evaluator regarding their initial estimates of learning loss in Kenya and Nepal as a result of COVID-19. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. Our chair and also one of the presenters is Pauline Rose, who is the director of the Real Centre at the University of Cambridge, and she's also the technical director of the GEC's independent evaluator. And we will also have Paul Atherton, who is the Managing Director of FAB Inc. and the Evaluation Studies Lead for the GEC Independent Evaluator. So thanks very much. Over to you, Pauline.
Thank you, Sharon. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to be sharing some preliminary findings from the first of the independent evaluation studies, which I'll just give a brief overview in a moment. As Sharon mentioned, I'm the technical director of the independent evaluation, and you can see a number of logos down the bottom here. The lead of the independent evaluation is Tetra Tech, and there are other members of us who collaborate on this independent evaluation. So if we could go to the next slide. So in this session, I just want to just very briefly give you an overview of the scope and purpose of the independent evaluation, because it's a bit different to other evaluations. I think a number of you on this call are probably already familiar, but there are, I'm sure, some others who perhaps have sort of hearing about it for the first time. We're going to be focusing here not on 2, but on 1 evaluation study, which is the one on promoting access and learning for marginalised groups during COVID-19. There has been another one that is going on almost at the same pace, but not quite as far advanced as this one, that is on teachers and teaching, and we hope to be able to present that to you in a future seminar. So we'll be hearing from Paul on some of the very preliminary findings in relation to learning loss that is part of this study, and provide some initial conclusions, but hopefully open it up for discussion. And in the discussion, we would really encourage you to think about, how do the findings resonate with your experience? I know there's a number of you who have experience on the ground. Are they things that you have seen in the context that you're familiar with? Are there different things? And to sort of have a discussion that might help to inform the further development of this work, and also a sort of broader understanding of the implications of COVID-19 for the most marginalised girls. And so move on to the next slide. So the independent evaluation started in February 2020 and is expected to go on until June 2025. And as I mentioned, it has a different format to a lot of independent evaluation studies. So although to some extent it might be for accountability purposes to see, how the programme is actually achieving its aims, actually it's also importantly, and perhaps more so, about learning. So learning for the FCDO, learning for the implementing partners, and learning for the fund manager, as well as, I think, for the sort of global community more generally. And this is actually even more important in the context of COVID-19, because we might have set ourselves targets of saying we want so many more girls in school, so many more girls learning, but we know that everything has been disrupted. So the types of implementation that had been planned has had to be adapted, and there's been a lot of other challenges that will have affected the ability to achieve the desired goals. So it's more, and particularly for these two first studies, more about learning and that more formative approach to evaluation. In addition, there's the idea is to have evaluation studies with a different focus. So rather than one overarching evaluation, to say, okay, what are some of the key areas that are of most relevance? And the topics for these arrived at through consultation with implementing partners, with members of FCDO who are very much engaged with the Girls' Education Challenge, and with a number of different experts, and of course with the fund manager. So, there's a lot of dialogue about how to identify the focus, and as I've mentioned, the two for this first one are on access and learning in the context of COVID, and on teaching and learning, teachers and teaching, again, more specifically in the context of COVID overall. For each of the evaluation studies, the idea is to include a number of different countries and implementing partners within it, so projects within it, so around 3 to 5 within each of them. In addition to this evaluation, there is also a rapid research and learning fund, for which the first call has already happened, and we're hoping that we will be able to move forward with the successful candidates for that in the near future, and we expect there to be another round also. So I think I'm now going to hand over to Paul, who will provide us with the substance for this session. And as I said, please do continue to think about your reflections, put comments in the chat as we go along. We'll then be compiling these, and we'll call on some of you who are making those comments to come in and speak once Paul has presented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pauline. Thanks to everyone for logging in today. I think these are very preliminary results. We've tried to focus on some key headline findings, but underpinning this all is a lot more analysis and work to be done. So what I'm presenting today is just one part of our study. So this is the quantitative part of the study, looking at learning losses in Kenya and Nepal, and we're very grateful to the help and support of EDT and Mercy Corps, who have facilitated a lot of this work as well. So I'm just going to tell you through some of the results on learning losses, but just to flag that alongside the learning losses, we also have some in-depth qualitative research, which we'll be using over the coming months to help really unpack some of these findings. So I'm just going to talk through very quickly Kenya, first of all, where we've worked with, next slide please, EDT essentially to build a repeated cross-section from the midline evaluation. So they tested a lot of children in 2019 in July in term 2. So we went back to the same schools to test the children again in earlier this year, which was also in term 2. So I think the first thing to say here, and we find this in Nepal as well, is the learning losses on average are real, but we'll talk through some of the variation because there's some things which have surprised us a little bit. But we do find statistically significant learning losses in both subjects, which is quite a robust finding when we throw at it all the background statistical tests. So that's a kind of headline finding that we find that there have been learning losses on there have been learning losses on average in both subjects. Learning has fallen more in reading than mathematics, but from a higher level. And we will begin to unpack this a lot more as we move forward. Next slide, please. So when I said on average we've seen learning losses, one of the things we found, and this is actually backed up in another study we saw with maths, is that the learning losses vary, and for some areas we've actually even found learning gains. So this is just two very simple maths. The key thing here is any school that's in green is actually showing a learning gain. So this is the average score for children, girls in Form 1 and Form 2 in these compared to the average score in 2019. So when we look at it, we were pleasantly surprised to see that it isn't just learning losses everywhere, but some parts have shown a gain. A priori, at first glance, we're not seeing a real spatial dimension here. It seems to be more evenly distributed across the country. So there's something here that even within localized areas, we're seeing some schools with real learning gains and some with learning losses. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've been trying to do is just try to contextualize this a little bit. So we've been trying to say, well, so what does this mean? We're talking about learning losses, but how does this relate to kind of previous lessons of learning? So what we've done here is we've looked again and said, okay, well, how much were children learning before COVID? And for this one, we looked at using the midline data, what the average increase between grades was, and tried to use this to equate to equivalent years of schooling. What we're finding, and this is something to kind of unpack and we can come back to, is that actually because learning levels were so low previously, the equivalent learning losses are quite high. So we're finding on average a loss of about 2.5 years in maths, and it's a bit higher in reading. We'll show you in the next slide. The key thing here, and just shown on this graph, this is a school level average increase or gain. And again, you can see on the left-hand side that there are some schools here where it's gains, and then there are some schools with very, very high percentage point decreases in learning as well. So a lot for us to kind of unpack, but certainly the key message here is that the situation is not uniform across the country. The local scenario and local context does seem to matter. Next slide, please. For reading, we actually don't find the learning gains per se, but we do seem to find substantial variation in learning losses. So some areas and some schools are seeing very high levels of decline, and some areas are seeing less. So again, this is just something we need to dig into. When we do the equivalent years of schooling calculation here, we find that the learning losses on average are equal to about 3.5 years. And in the longer paper, we've begun to unpack these on a kind of question by question basis. I'll talk through some of that for Nepal. It's not in here in the interest of time, but that's something we're looking at in terms of what tasks children are struggling with on average. It seems like the easier tasks are being maintained, but the more difficult tasks are certainly being lost. But again, that'll be something for the full report. Next slide, please. So one of the things we also did is we also just asked the teachers. As I said, this is still the quantitative one, not the in-depth qualitative surveys we have as well. But we asked the teachers some very simple questions. One, how long were your schools closed? And two, how well do you think you could do helping the children? And we'll come on to some of the children's perspectives in a moment. But I think one thing which surprised me is that although schools were closed on average for 7 months, they seem to reopen at different times. So even within the same county, we have some schools which are open after 5 months and some schools which took 10 months to open. So up in Ghana, for example. So it does seem to be that there's a lot of local differences in what is happening in terms of the support, the girls' learning losses or gains, but also crucially when they reopened. And we have some information on how they reopened, and a lot of them did seem to prioritise the examination grades as well. But there's a lot more to unpack there. We find that when we asked the schools were, quite honest with us in terms of the struggles to reach the children. So we just asked them to estimate quite simply the percentage of children they could reach, and you can see that, like the vast majority, I think 90% plus, said that they could only reach half of their students, which, it is quite unsurprising, but still quite sad, So I think, again, we see some variation amongst the schools, some saying they can reach a lot, but overall, they did seem to communicate that they really struggled to provide continued support during these school closure periods, which is very important for policy making going forward. Next slide, please. Finally, we did a child level survey, which I've just pulled out here the kind of simple questions on how the girls use their time and if they studied. And in Kenya, we actually find, a couple of things. One, the level of studying was quite low. So I think 26% reported not studying at all during school closures. 3/4 said they did study, but then when we asked a little bit more, how often did you study? Of the 75% who studied, only 1/3 studied every day, which is very low. So that takes us to just 1/4 of students reporting studying every day. And just over half said they studied twice a week or more. So the kind of continued education through school closure seems to be quite low, certainly for the Kenya sample. Nepal was a bit higher, as we'll come on to. Secondly, this is for me quite interesting, is that we actually found that they reported doing less caring responsibilities, less fetching water and less agricultural work than before. Part of this could be that household size seems to have increased as well. So when we've been speaking to people and trying to unpack it, it seems to be that there could be an explanation here that because there's more people around, the girls' kind of pressure for the girls to do some activities is not as great as before. But this is something we want to explore a bit more. It does seem that the involvement in paid work has increased, which does strike with a lot of the increases in poverty as well. And this is something where when we start digging into the qualitative work, there's a lot of concerns from parents, especially about children not having things to do, constructive things to do. Okay, let's move to Nepal now quickly, and then we'll come back for questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've put in here that it's in Kalari in Nepal. So this is in the northwest region where Mercycall's been working for quite a few years. So next slide, please. So again, here we worked with Mercycall sample, so we replicated the midline as much as possible. One thing about Nepal, which differs from Kenya, is we actually managed to find some of the girls who were in previously. So here we can do 2 sets of estimation. For the geeks amongst us, we've got the repeated cross-section, but we've also crucially got a panel of girls, so the same girls as 2 years ago. So they were 15, now they're 17, and they're still in school. So we can do estimations of both the repeated cross cohorts and also the panel girls for that context. We actually see, again, learning losses here, quite significant, statistically significant learning losses. Again, robust estimation using school fixed effects and the econometric modelling we're doing. For the cross cohort girls, we find a drop of 19 percentage points, so quite high in the context, especially given the low previous scores. And we see this for the panel girls as well, although we do see some differentiation between the subjects for the panel girls, which we don't see for the cross cohorts. And again, we're going to unpack this and have a look at some of the specific questions, but just for context, one of the questions is, what is 3/5 as a percentage? And you know, for a 17-year-old girl, they should be able to do that, but we actually find only 8% can now do that. So these are relatively simple mathematical operations. Next slide, please. Again, we find that these losses are not uniform, and we'll show the same in the bar chart in a moment. And we find that here, you know, we have some learning gains in some schools and for some girls as well. We'd obviously expect it more for the girls, given that they've been in school for 2 extra years. So we'd probably expect gains to be the norm, just because of the natural progression. But for the cross-cohort girls, we find substantial variation. So if we look at the top left of this map on the left-hand side, we see a school with a gain and then a school with a 30 percentage point drop very near to each other. So even within clusters of schools, we see substantial variation in learning gains and learning losses, which is something for us to unpack a lot more over the coming months. Next slide, please. Again, this is just the same information we've laid out in a different format. It's the biggest challenge here we had when we talk through the equivalent years of schooling. Because the learning profiles are so flat, we actually find for some schools some equivalent years of schooling, which I think the technical term is preposterous. Here we find on average losing 13 years, but this is simply because they have really flat learning profiles. So I think it's very, you know, we've got a bit more work to do to just double check and think through how we work and interpret this, just because the flat profiles means that it is very high equivalent years of schooling, because sadly a year of schooling doesn't seem to be worth that much in this context. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, very quickly, you'll see that we've been mirroring the analysis for both countries in the first instance. We again find substantial variation in when the schools were closed, how long they were closed for. Again, you know, it was 6 months on average. Kenya was 7 months, but we do find again some schools which were opened after 3 months, some opened after 9 months. So we do see quite substantial variation in when the schools were closed and how they reopened. So it seems like very much a kind of more localized decision based, I don't know, on the risk levels of the localized context. It'd be good to hear from people if this is the experience they found as well. The school seemed to be a bit more positive in terms of how many they could help, but it was still very low. So I think 62% said they could reach half per student. And 16% said they could only reach below 25% of their students. And again, if we just look at the map, the spatial patterns don't seem to be jumping out at me personally, and it'd be good to hear from people that know the context better. But we see schools who report they can only reach 25% of the pupils, next to schools we'd say they can reach 75%. So there's a bit more unpacking to be done there as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, again, we asked the girls here, and this is still the quantitative survey, not the qualitative. So there's a lot more fascinating information to come. Again, we find very low levels of studying compared to what would have happened in schools. If you compare to a standard school day, even after adjusting for absences, we still find very low levels, but actually higher here than in Kenya. So I think 86% of girls reported that they had been studying during school closures, of which 67% of those said they studied every day. So again, it's higher, but it's still only 60% of the girls saying they're studying every day. So it does seem to be a challenge due to school closures in these contexts to get continued studying as well. And, you know, a lot higher reported studying twice a week or more. What's interesting to me is there seems to be a balance between what the schools are telling us in terms of how many girls they can reach and what the girls are telling us in terms of what their studying patterns were as well. Just to finish here before we open up for questions, we do find that a priori I would expect the girls to have more household chores and household burdens during school closures. As I mentioned before, in Kenya, we didn't find this in our sample, but in Nepal, we do. So we actually find quite a noticeable increase, a significant increase in the need for them to care for family members, to go and fetch water, to help out with agricultural work and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to kind of give people a taste of the next steps, as I say, these are the kind of headline findings, which we're now moving towards unpacking a little bit more. As I say, we as well as having the quantitative survey, some of the data we've cleaned and analysed, and some is still in process. But we've got the qualitative information for the 4 schools in each country. So we're going to use that alongside the in-depth quantitative work to try and unpack some of these experiences a bit more, to have a look and see if we can explain any of these learning losses or learning gains based on some of the other information we have, and we'll be doing that over the next few months and try to see if we can identify, you know, any enabling factors or mitigating factors which may or may not have influenced learning losses or gains. Let me stop there, and I think we can open up questions and comments. It'd be great to hear if this chimes with people, because there's a few parts here which we were surprised by.
Thanks, Paul. I think sort of already impressive findings, although, as you say, sort of at preliminary stages, and there's been quite a lot of activity in the chat. I should say Teams always seems to have a problem for me, and my chat was disabled, so I missed a few seconds of what you were saying to go off and come on again, and been working with colleagues to try and check that I've got all the comments and questions that are coming up. And Maho, thank you, has been also responding to some of the points in the chat as we go along. I think there's quite a few points that are just wanting some clarification on the approach to looking at learning loss. So Paul, I think, for example, looking at just a question about from Stuart, are the average years of previous learning based on the national average or on the average for each particular school? And a question also from Emily on, have you done any disaggregation by age, grade, school type, region, for example, along with girls, looking at the sort of different forms of intersection? And I guess that potentially relates to the next question about the sample size. So I think if we're correct, the sample size is around 134, is that right? So questions about how representative that is, and I guess that has implications for how disaggregated you can go. And so let me stop there. So I think there's sort of related questions on how you've gone around the learning loss by school or averages and the disaggregation and sample size.
Okay, cool, thank you. So we might be able to unhide some of the background slides. I don't know if that's possible, but some of the background slides, slides 22 and 23, we have some information on the sample size, if you can hide them. The first question, I think, was Stuart. So Stuart, we inherited the midline sample. So we're as representative as the midline sample is for the 50 schools in Kenya, for example. So they're not nationally representative. You know, like the sampling was done, I think, to represent the GEC project with treatment and control. We're not looking at that information, but we are representative in the same way that the midline data is representative. The way to think about it is you can, because they're not the same girls, although we'll come back to this in Nepal, for the repeated cross sections, the overall sample here, I think they're doing it. It's about 5,000 girls in total we have, split between the two. But because these are not the same girls, we've essentially had to aggregate up to do some of your power calculations in terms of the schools. So it's a bit more complicated, but it's reasonable enough for us to have a reasonable degree of confidence in the overall findings on learning losses. Although I think there are some challenges when we start coming to the individual school level, where you may, an individual grade level, where you may only have 5 or 6 girls in each grade. So then you get into the small cell kind of challenge. So I think that's one of the first ones, and it leads into the other question as well. Certainly for Kenya, and if you can just flick to the next one, which has the same kind of information for Nepal. So here, the Nepalese sample is a bit smaller. I think The midline data had 432 girls in grades 9 and 10. We actually collected a bit more because if you go into the school, the costs are, not that much higher. So I think there are overall sample is 1,500 girls, give or take, of which 113 are the same. So there we're trading off having, a smaller sample with it being exactly the same girl. Because there are some advantages of it being the same girl in terms of most of your other characteristics and statistical analysis. So the kind of sample sizes. Does that answer the question?
Thanks, Paul. It does from my point of view, but I think if there's any other things that people think aren't yet answered, please bring them in. Ben Piper, I can see that you're putting some really interesting things in the chat about some studies that you're doing in Kenya and elsewhere that perhaps have some similar findings, but some differences as well. And you've got a couple of questions. I wonder if you would mind unmuting yourself and just coming in rather than me trying to paraphrase. Are you able to unmute?
I think his internet might be bad. Oh, he's here.
I'll try, but I'll talk fast. Hi, Pauline.
Okay.
Just a quick one, Paul. I actually would just love for you to give kind of your summary estimate on average, what the loss would be from the Kenya in particular. We had a paper come out in IGAD that kind of looked at the combination of skill deterioration as well as opportunity cost of being away from school. That depending on the country, the estimates for loss were substantially higher than what you're finding. I know it's sobering, but if I'm understanding correctly, that losses, your estimates are suggesting around 20% or so. That's relatively good news. Some of our estimates were significantly larger than that. Thanks.
Fine. Thanks, Ben. So yeah, we're estimating 20 percentage points decline in scores. Ben, what's worrying is when we translate this into the equivalent years methodology, we find 2.5 years worth of lost learning. So it'd be interesting to know if we looked at it compared to previous learning. Are you still finding that it's even greater than 2.5 years? Because 2.5 years is quite shocking.
And I think that's only for one country starts at 2.5 years. Then it goes like up to like more years for Nepal.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm just perusing the chat, and I'm just going to go from what's at the bottom of the chat for the moment. Kevin, you've put a point. I think it was quite an interesting one about learning gains. So you've sort of a variety of differences across the schools in terms of some having gains and some having losses. Kevin, do you want to unmute yourself and just come in, make your point, comment?
Thanks. So I think my question would be, because when you started the presentation, you highlighted that there were instances that we realized learning gains. So it would be interesting to share with us, what did those girls do differently that they managed to realize learning gains when most of the girls experienced learning loss? Additionally, did you figure out how we will address the learning loss and how long it will take us to get girls back on track? Thank you.
Cool. Shall I answer that quickly, Pauline?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'll come on with a couple of others.
Of course. So the first one, I'd like to say, if you give us a couple more months, then we can really try and unpack this a little bit more. I've got to confess that when we do the kind of basic analysis, to just have a look at the correlates and say, okay, well, are these learning gains in areas where girls are reporting studying more? Are they in, like areas which seem to be the schools were closed less? Are they in certain geographical areas? We're not finding any real correlations in the kind of first wave of analysis. So that's where we want to really unpack it a little bit more and have a look at the qualitative information as well. So I think there's still a piece of work for us to do in to try and understand some of the kind of confounding factors and some of the enabling factors in these areas. Because at the moment, the kind of simple explanations don't seem to be coming through, at least through the statistical analysis. In terms of what needs to be done and how do you get back, Well, that's a $24 million question, or whatever the phrase is. I think personally that when we're looking, there's some quite simple kind of foundational tasks which children are struggling with. It's easier for us to analyse and pull out the kind of mathematical operations and tasks there as well than it is some of the reading. Some of the reading questions are quite subjective, should we say. So I think for me, targeted support, especially to the low performers, is a bit of a no-brainer, because they've really been struggling as schools. The other key policy implication for me is whatever we've been doing, unfortunately, we need to improve, because they're really struggling to reach the girls. The schools are struggling, the girls are reporting not getting any support. So I think the first step would be to re-evaluate the support which has previously been offered and see how can we tailor this to get those reach figures a bit higher.
Thanks, Paul. So there's a couple of other comments in the chat that are also about disaggregation. So I think you've answered it already, but just to note that there was one to have the results being disaggregated by rural, urban and/or disability. I think probably you've already answered that. Sandra, I know that colleagues have, related to our RISE work in Ethiopia, have done some work on disability and learning loss in Ethiopia. And if you are able to put that in the chat, that might be of interest. But Paul, and I think what would be also helpful if others have work that is ongoing, a bit like Ben was indicating in their work in Kenya and elsewhere, please also do put that in the chat, because I think sharing our knowledge and resources is really helpful. There are a couple of questions that were related to each other, one from Ian and one from Andy, on whether you have other information on other forms of learning that were happening and other forms of competencies beyond literacy and numeracy that might have been happening during school closures, and whether one can also sort of assess that learning. Again, I suspect I know the answer to this, but Paul, good to hear your thoughts and also thoughts from others as to other work that might be going on in this area.
Yeah. So the answer to the last one is unfortunately not. We were quite limited in time in terms of getting, and also the other challenge we had was a real practical challenge. Schools had only just reopened. We had to get in before exam time. So we were quite cautious in our ask from the girls and focused just on the kind of measurement from the before and after. So we focused on the SEGMA and SEGRA because we didn't want to detract too much from the school. And the kids had already lost a lot of time. We didn't want to take them away for another 2 days to give them a battery of tests. So I think, no, unfortunately, we don't have kind of wider non-mathematics and reading outcomes, certainly not all the time. In terms of disaggregation, we have started doing some disaggregation and looking at kind of subgroup analysis. I think one of the biggest challenges, and the slide here will show you, is the prevalence of children reporting disabilities is actually quite small. So if we're looking at, say, 1-2% of children before and after, then it statistically it becomes challenging. Especially because for the repeated cross sections, you might only have one girl in each school in each wave who is reporting these disabilities. Really interesting, actually, just as an aside, most of the disability prevalence didn't change too much, apart from remembering. We've noticed a higher share of children reporting having difficulties remembering post-COVID than before. Which, if you've been out of school for quite a while, might explain some of it. But again, that's just conjecture at this stage. So yeah, we are doing some subgroup analysis, but we do have to be very cautious with kind of like small sample issues because we have this repeated cross-section.
Thanks, Paul. So there's also a question that Ben has put in the chat about how their work in Nepal has showed lower learning losses in primary than some other countries. Not to say that it's not a threat. And Laura Atherton has also asked a question related to the household chores. So whether you think the difference between Kenya and Nepal on chores has anything to do with the COVID prevalence in the country, in each of the countries.
Really good questions. For the kind of comparable analysis, so we didn't set out to do kind of cross-country analysis and treat them, but there's always a temptation to do this, so we have been looking at it. I have to say the biggest challenge is, even though they're both Sigma tests, for example, the questions are different. The Nepalese questions are actually easier, so the Kenyan tests are actually harder than the Nepalese test, but there are some items which are very similar in the kind of concepts that they're looking for. We generally find the overall scores to be lower in Nepal, and so to what extent that might drive differences, I don't know. It's not something we explicitly set out to do, but it's a bit of an itch that you're going to have to scratch at some point, so we'll probably end up having a quick look at it. But I'd be cautious simply because it wasn't the same tests, and the test items do differ depending on the context, with the Nepalese test being easier in our situation than the Kenyan test. So I think we have to be cautious with cross-country comparisons when we're actually looking at different ages and different items as well. But I will have a look at it at some point. Sorry, Pauline, what was the second question? Oh, the COVID prevalence. You know what? If somebody has time, then again, you could overlay the spatial COVID cases. The problem there is reporting. We don't really have robust estimates of localized COVID cases to look at. So there could be something on timings of waves and timings of when COVID happened in terms of whether you're in the household or not. We don't know. The one thing we have seen in Kenya is the household size has increased a little bit. And when we were speaking to some of our colleagues in Kenya, that seemed a plausible explanation. Again, we'll try and have a look into the qual data to see what's happening there. But yeah, that's something we can definitely add on to the list of a possible explanation.
Thanks, Paul, and also thanks so much to colleagues who are putting some links in the chat. So Naveen, thank you for the link to the Mercy Corps document on what's been going on within the Nepal project, and also one, so just scroll up too far, from Caroline Jordan on the findings from Sierra Leone, where learning gains, so there's been some discussion in the chat about learning gains rather than learning losses, and in that context, learning gains are found to be amongst the wealthier households. So I think that's also an interesting comparison. One question from Stuart Johnson. I don't know, Stuart, do you want to also unmute yourself and come in and ask about the link with the GEC interventions?
Yeah, thanks, Pauline, and thanks, Paul. Yeah, it was just a question of, so one of the questions we've had in our minds for a while is, well, first of all was, are we going to see the expected learning loss that I guess many of us expected, which I think you're answering, which is really compelling and obviously distressing. But equally, the question has been, because GEC projects have put a number of interventions in place, is do we see any relative benefits from those interventions vis-a-vis schools where there were at least fewer interventions, maybe only the kind of interventions provided by the national government, for example. I think the answer is no, but I wondered whether you'd run the same kind of post-COVID learning assessments with a comparison group that might help to answer that question.
Cool. Thanks, Stuart. So I think we do have treatment and control group schools in our sample here. I think one of the questions is, in terms of the response, there's some contamination of treatment control. We've not presented it in that way, simply because this is not an evaluative study. We didn't set out to look at the effectiveness of, individual projects, evaluations, and certainly the kind of statistical rigor wasn't there to do that. That said, we do have that information, and we will be looking at the kind of project support and the support that was offered more widely. So not just the projects, but the government as well. So we will be able to speak to a certain extent in terms of, the activities which were going on, what the girls are reporting in terms of their support, in terms of like WhatsApp or school books at home, or like support from teachers, support from parents, radio, TV. So we will be able to look at that, and that's something we will unpack. But it's important we're not going to do it in an evaluative sense, if you will. So it will be taken in the round in terms of broad support.
Thanks, Paul. If I've missed anything in the chat, please do repost your question, because there's been a lot of engagement, and I do hope colleagues are saving all the questions and documents and so on in the chat, because I think these would be really helpful. So I think this sort of is a question that you've indirectly been referring to, Paul, about the learning gains, and I think we were just talking about it again, what has enabled the learning gains in some schools. I don't know if you've got anything more to add on that.
No, I have to say, it's something which is on our to-do list, and this is the kind of perils of presenting early preliminary results. We wanted to get the key messages out. We didn't want to wait until August, September, by which point we'll have the answer to that question, or we'll have a lot more the answer. But I think because there's some key points here which are very important as we move into another wave and schools may close again, they've just closed in Uganda and Nepal. We made a decision to present the headline findings before we knew the complete story. So please forgive us for that. So the answer to that is I honestly don't know at this stage. We will dig into this. We will try and unpack it using the additional statistical stuff and the qualitative stuff. It'd be great to hear from people if in their experience they've seen this. So Caroline mentioned, that they saw it in the wealthier household. That's something we can explore to a certain extent. If other people think that, there's any other leads which we might want to explore, it'd be great to hear from people.
Thanks, Paul. I'd also just like to see, I can see Naveen, for example, from Mercy Corps has been helpfully putting some things in the chat. I don't know if colleagues who've been on the ground implementing these projects during these challenging times just want to come in and say anything about, not necessarily in relation to the findings specifically, but also just some of the experience that you found on the ground. So I'm just going, Naveen, you might not want to, but just give you a moment if you want to come in and say anything.
So thank you, Ola, and hi everyone. So I'm Naveen from Nepal, so who was responsible for implementing the project in Kailali. So actually, first of all, great to have all these findings, and that will definitely support for designing new programs, or like I think directing GEC in futures, like because we are expecting the third wave again. So now we are in second wave, the schools are again closed. And also we have recently closed the project. Maybe the learning loss will definitely go higher in the futures, because during the time of before the survey, we had really supported the girls at their household. So we quickly adopted our intervention on homeschooling, or like a distance education through radio. And there were a lot of girls who are transitioned from these schools, and they are supporting the younger girls in the same community. So that helped them to continue their learning. So the learning loss during that time was not really not big, but now I think it's increasing again. So there is people are making a lot of jokes again on the girls, or on the boys who are passing their secondary school education. So it can be also bigger stigmatizations in the future. So we have to be very careful on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Naveen. I'm not sure if there's anybody on the call also from the Kenya partner, but
I am on the call.
Great. Do you want to go ahead and?
Yeah. Okay. This is Mark. I just want to make two comments. One is that we have found some correlation with the number of hours a learner spends at home doing learning activities. So the longer they spend the time in learning activities, the more gains they have in learning. So that's one thing that we found in our own works. So this is really dependent on parental engagement. So I know there's been a comment about chores there. So if parents are not giving learners chores or sending them away from their homes, then they would have more time to engage with learning activities. The second one that I just wanted to comment based on our own experience is that learners who came together as a group to do community-based learning seems to have gained better learning outcomes than those who are studying on their own or not having any exposure to learning at all. So we have been able to see that in areas where there was safe spaces and there was, provision of maybe radios where they could sit and learn together, that most of those groups had better learning outcomes. And of course, we had very significant geographical differences from urban to rural, and also between literacy and numeracy. So a lot of variations, geographical and also by subject. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think it's really helpful to get perspectives from those who've been implementing some of these programs. And I know there's a number of other partners from other countries too that I'm sure these things are likely to resonate with and might have some findings that we'll be able to hear about in due course. I think there was some response already in relation to disability. I'm not sure, Paul, if you want to add anything more. There's a couple of questions around the financial implications, whether the issues around financial factors hindering girls' learning during COVID has come up, and also whether there's any information on the extent to which girls have been supporting other siblings during the school closures, if I've got that right.
Yeah, so we've I think Mahal can jump in. We've got some information on who helped support. So in terms of siblings, parents, teachers, other community members, so on and so forth. So we can begin to unpack that a little bit more. On the disability point, as I said, we basically can disaggregate by disability, but it's very small samples, so we've got to be really cautious in that way. So I think we have done it. I can't remember the findings, but I think we're a bit worried that because the sample is so small that going into that kind of level of detail is challenging. On the financial parts, I think this is an interesting point in terms of barriers, and it can play out in a couple of ways. One is that poverty will increase. I think we saw in Kenya, they might not be doing chores, but they're being asked to work in family businesses more. So as poverty increases, working in income generation may increase going forward. The other is the kind of thing which Caroline mentioned, which is to do with access to devices and access to, even if it is remote learning done through technological basis, through TV, radio, so on and so forth, getting access, that can be a problem. And we're looking a bit more in terms of what the girls are telling us in the qualitative work as well, in terms of, like getting access to devices, to control the devices is a big question as well. So even if the quant tells us that there's a device in the household, that doesn't necessarily mean that the girl can access that device at the time where the radio show is on, or so on and so forth. So all of this information we're going to try and dig into and unpack with the combination of qualitative and quantitative. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm going to sort of bring us to a close here. I'm sorry if we haven't been able to quite answer all the really informative questions in the chat, but thank you to Paul for fielding as many as has been possible. I think one thing that this conversation identifies is that there's a real demand and thirst for this type of information, that some of it is pushing us to go further, whether through the GEC and or through other work that colleagues are doing around the world, including disaggregating, looking at different forms of learning and understanding the different types of learning that might be going on within and outside of schools. I think I just thought, and just to say that I know that also there are a number of other related studies that are going on, some of which are also in the chat here. And I think Harry Patrinos at the World Bank has been compiling a review of these studies that are looking at learning loss in a variety of ways. So you might want to check with Harry if you haven't already seen his paper, but also make sure that we have a way to compile things together, because I think there's a lot of learning. And I just wanted to end with, I think in the chat here, I think, Ben, you put the sort of point that this is heartbreaking. And I think at the end of the day, looking beyond the data and the numbers, the extent to which we're really seeing both these short-term effects on children's learning, but as several colleagues have said, the fact that this is going to actually have repercussions beyond this immediate response that we're seeing. And the question is what we can and should be doing about it, both within the Girls' Education Challenge, and I know there's a lot of innovations that are going on. So in the Teachers and Teaching study, we're hoping to sort of identify some of those that GEC partners have been introducing in relation to teachers and teaching, as Ben also indicates, to really think about what it means for pedagogy, what it means for how we actually adapt things within the schools to the extent that schools are reopening, and support children who may be continuing to be out of school. So I think there's a sort of onus on us all from our different perspectives to continue to sort of search for answers to these really important questions. So I'm going to finish there. I'm sorry, you can see there's some last minute things on the chat. But I think we might need to finish there, and if there are anything immediate, I'm sure that colleagues are happy for us to be emailed and to respond to them. And in the meantime, we will try and collate everything and look forward to the next seminar and hearing about some of the other aspects of the Girls' Education Challenge. So thank you so much to everyone for joining, and have a good day.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, all.
Thank you.